Okay, so this is the fifth video lecture on the chapter of global stratification. And in the last video lecture, I was talking about how elites maintain power and comparing some of the systems of stratification around the world, particularly how the United States is comparison to Europe or to England, to Great Britain, and then what was or wasn't a communist state in the former Soviet Union. In this slide, in this lecture, I want to talk about the language that we use to refer to the relative rank of countries around the world, and then what we mean by colonialism or a colonization versus a neo-colonization. Okay, so when we talk about nations around the world, you've probably heard the phrase first world, second world, third world. Well, sociologists argue that that's not a meaningful way of ranking people, ranking nations, that's an ethnocentric, because it implies that there's something better, that who gets to decide what's first, what's second, and it doesn't really tell us anything. All it tells us is sort of our relative opinion, right? Another one that you may have heard is the one developed, developing, or undeveloped or underdeveloped. And while this one is way more common, well, actually both of them are pretty common, this one is also not considered the best practices because it doesn't really tell us anything either. It is, again, ethnocentric, because if I'm in the United States, I have a highly industrialized world, I might look on an agricultural society and say they're undeveloped, but because they're agricultural, that may be very developed. So it's, I always like to use the example, if I'm a Native American, at the turn of the century, and I'm standing looking at the Konza Prairie, I'm thinking that is exactly as it should be. However, if I'm maybe an oil tycoon, or if I want to build apartments, I look at that and see it as underdeveloped. So that's not a terribly useful one either. The one that is considered the most useful and the current best practice is to describe nations based on their relative industrialization. The argument is that this one explains or gives us a sense of how people live. So in a least industrialized nation, this nation would be more of an agricultural nation. In an industrialized nation, it means that we rely on industry or creating things to make a living. And so it captures a quality. It captures a relative quality, not necessarily just a ranking of nations. And there's a nifty, one of the assignments, in some semesters I have two, but the assignment that I called Global Capitalism in Your Closet, I invite you to look at where items are made and then to refer back to your textbook. And in the book that I have available in front of me, it's page 225 and 215 and 216. I don't know what number it would be in your textbook, but it's a map of the world, and it's got the nations all ranked by their relative industrialization. And it also has a fourth category that's even more contemporary, because these are what we would call oil-rich or non-industrialized nations. So these are nations that are neither produce anything nor are they agricultural, but their wealth is generated through the extraction of oil. And so that's a different category altogether. I just found this really cool map. No, it's not in your textbook or anything, but it describes, or it's illustrating I believe it's the primary exporter. It's the primary way that those nations create wealth. And so what do we have? We are considered capital goods. Other parts of the world would be the production of soybeans, the extraction of copper, gold, coffee. That's Ethiopia's coffee is #1 export crop. Anyway, that was just kind of interesting. So point is that we don't use first, second, and third. We use industrializing because it's a descriptor of how people organize their life. Okay, so the last topic for this chapter is what is meant by colonialism, or when something is considered a colony. So one theory is that the way the world came to be ranked is partly influenced by powerful nations extracting raw materials for their profit. And that's what's called, that was what traditionally was referred to as a colony. So as Europe had colonies all over the world, including the United States and India and Africa, they would extract goods, like extract raw materials, tobacco, leather, coal, whatever, and sell it and profit. So that was what a traditional colony was, is that I would bring my people, what you have at the top here, right, where you have, Europeans, they came, they established themselves on the land, they began telling the local peoples what to do, then they became basically the leader, and the way they maintained their colonial relationship was often through violence and force, right? That was the colony until, like in our country, in our American history, we had a war to say, nope, we're no longer your colony, we are independent. And indeed, many of England's colonies did have a war for independence in the 20th century. This created, so that's one theory, and this created a system of what's called the world systems theory. And I should use another diagram, but the world systems theory is based on the concept of capitalism. It's based on the concept of buying and selling and trading goods around the world. And it is thought that slavery was the first world system. It was the first system in which, if you go back to that first slide, I'm just going to flip back to it anyway. If you go back to this slide, where the extraction of the raw materials were humans that were being extracted from Africa. In some cases, those humans were then being taken to South America. They were being exchanged for goods, for finished goods. Those goods were then being sold in Europe. That wealth, those dollars, were then being taken to Africa, right? And this became the system of global exchange. It was a world system of capitalism, of buying and selling. What world systems theory says is that all the nations of the world are ranked, and you have you have kind of like what you have, I have it all messed up here. You have kind of like what you might have in a high school, where you have like the really popular kids. In this case, these would be the core nations. And then you have the kind of popular kids that sometimes get invited to the party. And then you have the really weird kids that never get invited to the party, right? And so that was what the world system is the world system is, you can't read that, so let me try again. You have the core nations, and like the US would be considered a core nation. You have the semi-periphery nations, and then you have the periphery nations. The core nations are the really popular kids. They're the really wealthy ones. They're the ones that have the biggest military, right? Like the England and the United States and, I don't know, Germany, right? These are the nations that maybe, I don't know my world politics very well, maybe the big eight or the G8, anyway, all of the groups, all of the countries that have the biggest military and the most wealth and the most power, right? And then you have the semi-periphery nations. The semi-periphery nations are the ones that the core nations care a little bit about when they have something we want. So if it's over oil, for instance, or maybe you put Iraq and Iran and all the places that we send our military, for our economic interests, those would be in the semi-periphery. So those are the kids, when the popular kids have a party, they invite them sometimes. But the periphery nations, those are the nations that we don't even know the names of. Like if I were to hold up a map of the world, you don't even know the name of that country. You never heard of that country before, ever. Like the periphery nations are the ones who are those kids, right? And so the idea of the world systems is really that it's the core nations. They're the ones that call the shots. Right? They're the ones that influence everybody else. And some nations are just not even invited to the party. We don't even think about them. We don't even consider them. I've been trying to learn all the countries of Africa, and many of there's a couple on there I never even heard of before, right? So that's the other world systems theory. Neocolonialism. So if I were to draw a line right here between, so this is the theory about how the world became stratified. The world continues to be stratified by what this picture intends to illustrate, and that is neocolonialism. In other words, the new kind of exploitation. And the neocolonialism is based off not of bringing our military there and controlling you, but by getting in unfair economic arrangements with other countries. So we'll multinational corporations, or we will trade our military goods, or in exchange for your oil, or we'll build companies or factories. So it's a kind of exploitation, not of your raw materials. Well, in some cases it's your raw materials, but now through debt. Like we'll loan poor countries in Africa billions of dollars, but at an interest rate that they can't afford to pay back. If you've ever been in credit card debt, right, and you've tried to make your minimum payment and you realize you're never going to pay off that credit card debt because you can't pay more than your minimum. And so what happens in the really poor nations of the world is that they will be desperate. And so we will offer maybe us, maybe one of those core nations, will offer them a loan. But instead of that poor country investing in roads and healthcare and education, they are instead of you putting money in your savings account, you're paying MasterCard and you're never getting ahead. And so it remains stratified. The wealthy nations remain wealthy and powerful, and the poor nations remain poor. The same way that you never get ahead if you're always making the minimum payment on your credit card, right? And your people can't make more because you can't build up your infrastructure for your education or your technology because you're too busy paying off, another country. And if you don't pay them off, well, then they may invade you. Not saying that would be what we would do, but in some cases, loan sharks, countries do it too, just the same way people are, so countries. And so some ways we do that through multinational corporations. We may buy political stability. We could give weapons to, if there's a coup, like we'll give weapons to the side of the government instead of the side of the people, right? And then if you can't pay for it, then we'll pull our people out. So anyway, that's what we mean by global neocolonialism. Is the powerful still control the weak, but instead of having to do it with force, we can do it with money and companies. And I believe that wraps up this chapter. That wraps up the chapter on global stratification. The next one I will talk, it was more exclusively about social class stratification in the United States. And thank you for listening.